Today we're interviewing Mary Roxby Balch, a veteran of World War II. Mary was born in Lynn, Massachusetts on July 31st, 1923.
Yes.
And presently resides here in Fairhope, Alabama. During World War II, Mary served with the Technical Air Intelligence Center, U.S. Naval Intelligence, Washington, D.C. From 1943 to 1946, she was a WAVE, achieving the rank of Yeoman First Class. During World War II, the WAVEs were the women's branch of the U.S. Navy. This is the Veterans History Project for the American Folklife Center of the Library of Congress, and we are sitting in the Fairhope Public Library, Fairhope, Alabama, and the date is Wednesday, July 13th, 2011. And the interviewer is Colonel R.L. Upchurch, United States Marine Corps retired. Mary, welcome to the Veterans Project. How you doing?
I'm doing fine.
Good.
Well as can be expected, as they say.
Very good. You were a petty officer in the WAVES, and then the modern world, a lot of people won't know what that means or what it stands for.
Something
Can you
like
tell us?
80,000, something like that.
About 8,000?
Yeah, 80.
80,000. And what the WAVE stands for? What does that mean?
Women accepted for voluntary emergency service.
Very good. And this was only during World War II
Yes.
that applied.
They kept it on just for a short time. I mean, that name, when I came here, there was a WAVES National where we would meet at different areas and have gatherings at different areas just to keep us alive and keep us in track of one another. But we knew we were going to be disappearing. President Truman had made the decision to ask Congress. I'm not sure how the technical part of it is, but Congress passed a bill that our country would accept women in the military service. And at that time, WAVES disappeared.
Yes.
We were just a history.
Do you have any idea how many are still alive today?
No, I haven't. We had a group from Mobile, and that's where I started going, and we had our meetings over there once a month. And then we sometimes had meetings at different areas. For instance, they have a larger group in Birmingham. Birmingham has a larger population. So there were more people up there. And we would get together, and we invite them here, or they would invite us there. I was up to Tennessee, Boston. Boston had a huge, every other year, the WAVES get together and have private meetings, and no one else can be in there and listen to what we're saying. And they have had them in different locations of the country, one in Portland, Oregon recently. I say recently, it's within the last 10 to 12 years. Memphis is where we had the one. No, that wasn't a national, that was just an area group.
Well, it's wonderful that you're still able to get together like that and keep in touch. What about your family, or before you went into the military?
Sorry?
Before you went into the military, what were you doing?
Well, I had just graduated from a business college in Lynn, Massachusetts, but I didn't want to work in Lynn where GE was, and my sister and my father both worked for GE, but I wanted to do something different. So I approached the school and asked them whether I could be placed on the list for a job in Boston. And they had a school at that time in Boston as well. So I went to their personnel department and worked in an accounting office. It was Wade Guthrie, and I can't remember the name. It's written someplace around here. It was an accounting firm that was British, and they had their East Coast business in Boston. And I found after I started to work for them that I would be part of a steno pool forever. I would not be a private secretary. It couldn't work up because that wasn't the way it was done. And one day I was out at lunch, and there was a big recruiting bus out there, and a handsome young ensign handing out literature. And I stopped and asked him whether it would be possible for me to make an application and go through all the testing that's necessary to see whether I would pass and the Navy would accept me. I had to wait 3 more months. I had to wait until, well, the end of July, and this was at the end of March.
This was after the war started.
No, this was after. Yes, it was. The war was started in December in 41. The waves were formed in July 42. And this, my birthday, my 20th birthday was July, but I had to wait until that birthday showed up from March when I went to work there. And I left there in June. And then the Navy had sent me all this information to have my parents sign, all the things that they have to know about you before they will accept you.
How did your parents react to you doing this? How did your parents react to you going into the Navy?
My parents, when I came home after seeing that young man and bringing home all the brochures about the waves, when I came in the house, I said, "Here I am, everybody." That was my announcement, because I worked in Boston, and my sister and dad worked in Lynn, so I held up the dinner. And when I was, they saw the brochures in my hand, and I said, "Guess what I did?" And then I told them that I had stopped at the recruiting station and asked information, and they would have to sign. And my dad eyes opened and his mouth opened, and he didn't say anything, and my mother came over and threw her arms around me and started to cry. She said, "Mary, I don't want you to go, but if I were in your shoes, I'd go." And my dad said, "How come you chose the Navy?" I said, "Dad, you were in the Navy in World War I. How many parades did I go to and wave the flag when you went by? I didn't think of anybody else."
So he was in the Navy in World War I. Did you have any other brothers or sisters that ended up in the service in the war?
No. My parents were married, I think it was 1913. I don't remember whether. Anyway, they had one son, and he was 3.5 years old, and he died in January 1917 of diphtheria. And at that time, it was a treacherous thing, because they took the child from you, and you had to take the child to a contagious hospital. And this being their first and only, they were both torn up, so to think that they couldn't comfort that. My mother would go and visit and sit with him and hold him and talk with him, but she had a cutoff time when she had to leave.
So you can see why they were concerned that, that you would be going in the military, I suppose, during the war. Then.
After the war, after World War I, my dad came home, and, well, before he went, he was very much upset, both about their son dying and about the war being started. And he was working at GE, and that's where he met my mother. She was working there, but she wasn't working any longer. And when he went back to work, of course, after the baby died, it's just one of those things that happen in life. And then when the war was declared, and he continued to work for a while, he came home from work one day and told my mother, "Kitty, I have to go."
So he fought in the war.
So he was on different ships.
Yes.
He was on the Mount Vernon, and he was a head cook. And he approached his seniors and asked whether he could go to gunnery school. And they said, "No way, we're going to let you go. Every man in this ship depends upon you for their meals and for their coffee and for their strength. And you have to stay. So don't apply again."
So you were a family that served in 2 wars.
Yes.
Can you tell us where you went after you went in the Navy for recruit training?
Oh, I went back home to Massachusetts where my parents lived, and I took advantage of the GI Bill. I had become engaged the last few weeks that I was in the Navy.
I mean, before, when you went into recruit training, you know, right, after you enlisted in the Waves,
Yes.
where did they send you to train you?
Hunter College in the Bronx, New York was our boot camp. They didn't call it what they call it now. And when people talk to me about it, I say boot camp. But anyway, that was what it was. And I was there for 4 weeks. Normal boot training was 6 weeks, but they had doubled up on our training because they needed women so badly in all the offices everywhere and all other kinds of things. You went to boot training, and then from there that you spread out to do the other kinds of things where women were needed. And I wanted to be a link trainer operator.
Yes.
And the woman smiled and she said, well, I don't think that's possible. You were just graduated from a business college. We need people in offices all over the country. Where would you like to live? And I said I wanted to live in California. And that was turned down. I said, well, Florida, my grandfather is there. Sorry, that's filled too. How would you like to go to Washington, D.C.? Well, Washington was a sea of people.
Many people might not know what you mean by link trainer, it being an aviation trainer.
To prepare a pilot or a person who is training to become a pilot, a link trainer, you put in something that looks like the cabin of a plane, where all the instruments are to learn how to fly a plane. And I'm not sure exactly how the electronics work in it, but they had a good many women who were trained well enough so they could teach in these link trainers. And then when the boys were well enough educated so that they could trust them in a plane with an instructor, they were pretty well organized into at least this was this and that was that. It's like my new car, I'm learning all the buttons.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't ask for anything else except link trainer, and the woman who was our company officer is from Mississippi, Vivian Loggins, and she said, Mary, how would you like to go to Washington? And I said, okay.
And what did they send you to do there?
Well, she said, we have lots of openings. What bureau would you like to work? And I said, BuAer. I was fascinated by the aircraft, just as everybody else was at that time. And she said, I think we can fix you up. And so it was no time at all that I had information given to me telling me that we would have it, all of us who were graduating from, this was Stillwater, Oklahoma, where we had our yeoman training. And when we all headed in different directions when we finished that. And I can remember stopping in Chicago, and of all things, we went to see that great big department store in Chicago between trains, not planes. When we left boot camp to go to Oklahoma, and we went by train because there was a whole class of us all going at the same time. We met other train loads of military people, and at that time they were afraid of espionage. And our train headed to Canada and made a loop and came back down to Oklahoma. And because of that, I left the country. And that was on my record that I had left the country during the war. And my state gave a bonus of $200 when I came back.
For the train trip in Canada. Yes, for your train trip in Canada.
Yes.
And when you got to Washington working for BuAer, what type of work did they assign you there?
Oh, I was a secretary. And when the day I walked into the office, there were quite a few men there that time. And I opened the door and someone must have escorted me because it was in the Navy building, which is in downtown. I don't remember that part. But I remember opening the door, and when I opened the door, 5 men turned around and said, "Here she is." They had advance notice that I was going to start working that day. And they were desperate to have someone open files, get pictures of planes organized. They had to teach me how to identify all the Japanese planes, whether they were bombers or whether they were fighters. And I set up a file for all of those things. And then when the men were draftsmen and architects in that particular section where I worked. And they would take pictures of planes which were sent from the actual fighters had cameras on their planes. And they would send those pictures through Hawaii and on up to Washington. And those planes, those pictures were given to the architects and draftsmen to take specs so they could draw pictures with the right appearance, so that they looked exactly like it was a Japanese plane. And then from there were Hollywood people who had joined the Navy also. And there was one man whose name I thought, wow, he's here. He was heading up the training for people who needed to have Hollywood people make movies so that you could take those to someplace where they would have identification training. And I did that for about 2 years, just about the time the war ended. TAIC was living, we were transferred from downtown Washington to Anacostia Naval Air Station, because by that time we started to receive parts of planes, and we had a group of sailors who would put those parts together. Our office was in a hangar. We were on the 2nd floor of a hangar. We had 2 window air conditioners. The sailors didn't have any air conditioning. But you kept the doors open, and you were safe at Anacostia. And one of the men in our group was he came through. Technical Air Intelligence wasn't just in Washington. We were the headquarters for it. There were men all over the place on the field, and they would send back information. And it's something that you never talked about with anyone. Your roommate, what are we going to have for dinner tonight is what you talked about.
Yes. When you say specs, you mean wingspan and airspeed and things like that?
Yes. I use a term that they used. It's how big the plane is and what different identification marks you have on whether it's a Zeke or whether it's whatever else. And you know when that plane looks exactly like, these were bright men. They had a man who was given open ability, he was able to go to Bupers and look at people's files and picked out people, and he picked out people who were top of their class. They had joined the Navy and they were now off training for their beginning of their training. And he was able to pick people that he wanted, and he picked out both architects and draftsmen. Because this was such an important thing, he was given open charge or choose anyone, but I learned later, I didn't have any idea how I ended up there. I just happened to be in one of the top classes when I was in yeoman school. Well, I had gone to a business college before that, so all my skills was there. And we sometimes were given a Wednesday off after we have our battalion review, and on Saturday, and then we'd have exams, and then your results of your exam was we posted on Wednesday or Tuesday, I guess, early in the week. And the group that came out with the highest marks, the highest platoon, was given Wednesday afternoon off. And so 4 weeks in a row, our group won. So I was just in a group who were all well trained before they ever got there.
Well, I know that the pilots...
And then we learned all the naval history and the naval way of doing things, not just typing and shorthand. It was more rounding out your education.
Yes. Well, these pilots really appreciated, I know, what information you could pass on, because, you know, it's very important in combat that you have what you were doing.
Well, I just try to think myself when we were in there. Think how fast those planes go and how they're trying to dodge to get away from the guys who are chasing them. And you're taking a picture every time you open your guns. And all of that comes back to Washington, and we're trying our best to make good training films out of what they sent home. And it was something that it just made you feel good going to work every day.
Yes.
That you were doing something that was needed. And when people thank me today for having been a wave in World War II, I was the one who was benefited.
Yes.
I grew up, I learned how to be on my own, I learned how to find my way all around town, all kinds of things that a sheltered girl wouldn't have known. And I learned that it makes very little difference about your rating and your rank. You're all together trying to work and make bring the war to an end as soon as you can.
It's a wonderful philosophy. And
oh, another thing that's just, we worked with quite a few men. I was the first wave in there, and then they sent for some more. They got one more, and then we had, women were, there were advertisements in the papers all over the country for women to apply to work in Washington. My sister applied. She was accepted, but she refused. She just backed down. She thought, oh, why should I go away and have to find an apartment for myself all alone? And she just changed her mind. Well, when I joined the Navy, I knew I was being taken care of. They were paying me a whole $21 a day once a month. Well, it was a little bit more than that by the time I was in, but I know that they made up a song for the GIs about being paid $21 a day once a month. We didn't. We were paid according to rank or rate, and I was also in a lucky position when working there that they had openings for a wave, third class, second class, first class, and so as soon as I filled the time, I had a promotion. I had to go take some tests, but as you take your tests, and then they hand you a new pair of chevrons.
you mentioned getting a half a day off after your battalion review. What did you do in that extra time?
We wasted our time in the bakery, and we would go to a movie. We'd buy some. Luckily, Oklahoma A&M still had women at school there, and they were learning home ec, and they were practicing all kinds of good things on us. And when we were in boot camp in the Bronx in New York, you were just in old apartment buildings that had been donated or taken over by the military, by the government to use as barracks for women or men who were training in that area. And we walked over all over the Bronx among civilians. And we had to walk down to the college from where we lived for our meals. And a few days in our civilian clothes, when we arrived in New York, we went directly from the train into an area where we were all oriented, where we would be and so forth. And we were given instructions on where you go to have your feet measured so you can get shoes. They gave you shoes right away. And then they gave us a hat right away. But don't send your civilian clothes home yet, because we won't have uniforms for you. Then you go to a tailor, and the tailor's measured you for your uniform. So every person who received a uniform, it was specially made for you. So all your bumps and and they wanted to make sure that all the hems were exactly the same. If you line up, the hems are going to be the same when you march. You're not going to, these kinds of things. And we were in, imagine us, I was thinking about this, and I wrote it in one of the letters I wrote to someone, that imagine how funny we must have looked in those big black shoes, and they sized us a size larger than we normally wore, and I had blisters on my heel because I was half walking out of the shoes most of the time. But the whole atmosphere of the people you were with and the people who were training you was one of, hey, let's have a good time doing this, but always be on time, always do what you say you're going to do. And there were people from every state, just like you when you went into the Marines. There were people from every state. You weren't with your locals that you grew up with, and you learned from everybody in other states. And I had a heavy Massachusetts accent. I may have a little bit now, I don't know. But I was teased all the time about the way I pronounced certain words. And then I'd turn to a girl from Minnesota and I said, you don't have any accent at all. You're no fun. But, we teased back and forth and wanted to know something about the background. Do you have a brother or a sister? Is anyone else in the service? These kinds of things, getting to know people and knowing that they are your friends before you ever saw them. You knew that these people were your friends, and you stayed friends through school, and through then when we went to our other schools, they were storekeepers. I don't think they have that any longer. I was looking at a book that is the Admiral William P. Lawrence. I went to that commissioning, and the kinds of things that you see there and talk with people, you're melded into mostly, this is a southern location, this is Mobile. This is what we're proud of, that we have Mobile and we have a beautiful port for ships to come in. I went to the LST when it came in, and it came over from Greece and then Spain, and when I was there, it was a bitter cold day, but you look around and you know all of these men who were with you, and there weren't very many women. And I could see tears running down the cheeks of these men as they were watching that ship come in before it docked, just standing there watching it. And one man really started crying, and I asked him, he said, no, I was Army. They gave me a ride over to France. Oh. He was in the Battle of, that's not
D-Day?
D-Day. D-Day, June, yeah.
Well, the war, after the war ended, you didn't get out until 1946. What did you do until you were discharged?
Well, they closed down TAIC, but the man who was in charge of TAIC was a captain in Washington, and he had other things, other branches. And they asked if any of us would stay because they needed someone to push pencils. And so I said, I don't have any immediate need, so I signed up for another 6 months. And while I was in at that time, I was working just a short period of time in the captain who was in charge of all of us. I was working in his office, but he had a civilian secretary, and she was there for a long time, long before I went to work there. And Admiral Morrison was in the closed doors talking with his classmate who was in Washington. And when he came out of there, when I was sitting in the office, he put his hands on his hips and he said, "Well, look at you. You have a civilian and a wave, and all I have is a sailor. And I don't even know him well yet." And his buddy said, "Well, which one would you want?" He hemmed and hawed and said, "I'll take the wave." So I worked for an admiral for 6 months.
And that was Admiral Morrison?
Roxby. Admiral Morrison was one of the staff who were working there. He wasn't an admiral at that time. There was a whole group of captains, and each of them was putting together information that they had learned in fighting in the Pacific. And that was the survey of the Pacific bombing, bombing survey.
Yeah.
I have the words backed up, but that's what it was. And
what did you do for the Admiral? What type of work?
Secretarial again.
Did you do any research work for him?
No, well, I helped him put maps on the wall and put the pins in. And toward the end, just before my time was up, I was helping him put a map up, and we were marking places over in the Pacific where we might visit. But I didn't know they had a visit planned at that time. And just putting the pins in where, and just in chatting, he looked at my hand and he said, "Where'd you get that?" And I said, "Oh, I became engaged last night." "I'll go to hell. What did you do that for? We were going to take you to the Pacific with us." He said, "Can't you do anything about that?" I didn't.
Well, Admiral Morrison, was...
Sorry?
Admiral Morrison was, of course, a famous writer and Pulitzer Prize winner. That was quite an honor then to work for him.
He not only that, he was... President Roosevelt called on him and asked him when he joined the Navy. He heard, I don't know how the word got through, but President Roosevelt and he had a talk, and he said, "I want you to keep track, so we need the history of this war while we're here fighting it." And that was his job. So that's why he was there. And I don't remember the names of the others, but I do remember him. And we had a bunch of desks all lined up with just space enough between the desks to walk through. And it made no difference how high up your rank was. Admiral Morrison had a little box of a room, and I sat outside of it, and a captain sat across the way from me. And he was closer into Admiral Morrison than the others were. But they all worked with one thing in mind. Let's get it straight, because we have to write the history of this war.
Well, that's a wonderful service that he did. Well, he did so many wonderful writings.
Oh, have you read John Paul Jones?
Yes, yes. Did you ever see President Roosevelt while you were there?
Oh, only in public things, no. Didn't see him. He didn't go out to visit where our offices were. They would come to visit him.
Yes.
And they would stay at the hotel across the street.
Well, what about after the war was over and you left that job and that working for the admirals? What did you do then in your civilian life?
Well, first thing I had to do was register downtown for an unemployed person and see if they had any jobs anywhere where I could be useful. And I had a couple of temporary jobs that lasted a month or two. And then I decided I wanted to go to college. The young man I had become engaged to, I had worked with. He was an officer, and we never dated. We never had even lunch together while I was in the office, because that was no. Enlisted and military and officers didn't mix. But he called me one night after I had left, and even the barracks where I had been staying was closed down. And they put me in one that was in downtown. And he called me one night and asked me if I wanted to go out to dinner. And I said, oh, gee, this would be great. You know, get together with the old fellows. And he said, so-and-so is coming too. So we had dinner together several nights. And then one night the other fellow didn't come. And then he was a really nice young man. Portland, Oregon was his home, and he was a student at Hood. Not at Hood. Hood is where our daughter went to college. Anyway, whatever the college is there. And he left at the beginning of, or in the middle of his junior year, to join the Air Force. Air Corps.
Air Corps.
Nothing can stop the Army Air Corps.
Yes.
And he didn't do the kinds of work that I did. I mean, he was on the other side of the wall, let's say, doing other kinds of stuff. Most of what he did was reading and calculating. His major in college was physics. Mm-hmm. And when the war ended, his old boss called him and told him his job was there if he wanted to come back to work. But he was going to be transferred to San Francisco instead of Portland. And Dick was all excited that we'd have a chance to see San Francisco. My eyes just bugged out. I'll be seeing the West Coast. I won't even be close to home. Oh, all these kinds of things go through your mind. And anyway, as it turned out, he went back to his college, and his old professor wanted him to tutor a young boy who was having a hard time with his physics. And so Dick offered to do that. He said, you're the only one I know can teach this kid. He's smart, but he's uptight. And if you can help him, then anyway, so Dick did it. And that meant he was going to stay on the West Coast longer. And we were postponing our wedding. We hadn't made any set date, but we thought, well, we ought to do it in 6 months at least. Mm-hmm. And anyway, then he had spent a couple of weekends at my parents' house, and my parents agreed that he was a nice young man. And then, I mean, this was before he left Washington to go back home. And since he went back to college, I investigated going to Boston University. I had friends who'd gone to BU, and you can go there by taking the bus and taking the subway. You go 3 or 4 different ways, and you can get there finally. Nobody had cars then. You didn't drive. Still, gas was high. It's not like it is now, but gas was high for the income we had. And so I went by bus from Lynn to a subway, and then another subway, and I ended up where I was going at BU. And I went business again. Teaching was different from the business college, where that was more mechanical and make sure that you get your sentences straight and correct your boss in a nice way if he makes a mistake in his English.
So did you end up marrying this young man?
No. He and I corresponded, talked on the phone, and he was asked, to stay for 2 years at the college. And we didn't talk about my leaving BU and maybe going to school out there. That never entered our minds. I was still wearing his ring, and we got together with a group of others, Marine women and Coast Guard, Waves, Wax, all formed a little group at BU. and we did things together. I mean, our free time, but almost everybody was coming by public transportation to go to school. There was one girl was from West Virginia, and she took me up to see her room, and it was an old apartment, and they strung a string, not string, but rope across the room when they had to do their own laundry and hang the laundry up there before they went to school in the morning. And when I saw where they were living, I thought, oh, I'm glad I'm home. When I get home, my dinner will be ready. But even so, those girls were getting an education, and they wanted to do what they had to do to get the education. And these barracks were provided by BU. You had to pay for, not barracks, residences. You had to pay for it, but the military, or the Veterans Association, allowed you to have a living allowance so that you could pay for where you were living. And I had a different kind of an allowance because I was commuting and living at home.
This was a GI Bill.
On the GI Bill.
Yes.
But that, for me, and Dick was then on the GI Bill to paying for his, and he decided he wanted to get his PhD as long as he was on it. And that type of training, you just about have to have a PhD. And so he didn't accept the job with Metropolitan Life. He stayed at school, and we contacted one another by snail mail and telephone. And sometimes he'd send special delivery, and the mail would arrive 8 o'clock in the morning, and I'd have a letter to read while I was eating my breakfast. But we decided that, I decided actually, so the other girls were getting some parties together, and they said everybody else was having some kind of a dance or something, and someone asked me if I would join a sorority. And I was flattered because it was one of the young students who was just a sophomore in school. But I turned her down, and I hope I didn't hurt her feelings, but I just turned her down because I felt I had been through what society has in what am I saying? The women get together. Anyway. And I had to commute, and it would not have been very easy for me to get to their meetings. And so we did things together, and one of the girls was getting up a group. Some of the girls had gone back with their old boyfriends who'd come back, and they were all from Massachusetts. And they wanted to set up a dance where the sororities would set up dances. And they thought, well, the sororities, much younger girls, they probably won't enjoy our company as much as they would girls of their own age. So we got our own little group together and started having dances. And I didn't go to any of them because I was engaged. And I told Dick about this, and he said, why don't you just go to the dances? He said, it'll be a long time before you and I can get together. And so I stopped wearing my ring. And he came east that summer, and we talked a long time. I hadn't met Bob yet, but when I did meet Bob, I was in a Newman club, and the priest who was conducting services, retreat, at the end of the retreat, this was at a church that was close to where our section of BU was. We were all over the city, buildings here and there. It was like you plant a seed and it grows. And we had, anyway, he told us on the last night of our meetings that he had fixed the coffee pot, and all he had to do was just plug it in, and he had set notices around to some of the local colleges and told boys that some girls at such and such a location would be inviting people to come just for coffee. And he bought donuts and coffee and fixed the jukebox so we could play without putting any money in it. And Bob walked in with one of his friends who was going to Northeastern, and Bob was working at that time and waiting to hear from the B school to see whether he would be accepted at the business school. And that was how he asked, the other boy asked me to dance first, and then Bob asked me to dance, and Bob didn't, and I didn't dance with anyone else after that for a long, long time, 48 years.
Well, that's a good story. Yeah.
Wait a second. We had our 50th anniversary, yes.
You mentioned earlier that
Sorry?
you mentioned earlier that when you were a Wave, that you had really good feelings about what you were doing and what you were contributing in the NAIT or in the National Intelligence Service. Can you tell me if you had any other feelings when the war was over about your service? Anything that you learned or anything that you took with you for the rest of your life? Anything really stuck with you about that time that you were in intelligence?
Well, I had a self-pride. I felt I had done something, and there were a lot of girls would say to me, I wish I'd done that. And I didn't answer by saying you could have.
Yes.
But it was a feeling of having done something when that awful war was going on. My dad became a neighborhood, what do you call him?
Air warden?
Air warden. He had to do something. And when I stood guard, something in there suggested people that you met, besides having met Admiral Morrison. I met another admiral, Admiral Byrd. I was standing watch with my SP on my arm and holding a billy in my hand. And I was in the Navy building and the first floor deck. And someone walked by, stopped, and came back and stood in front of me. And he said, I'm Admiral Byrd.
This is the Admiral Byrd that went to the polls.
Admiral Byrd was there in Washington, and he always left the building late. Well, as I understand, when when Steve went through his jobs that he had when he was in the Navy, every job was a 12-hour job, 15-hour job. And so he was in the Navy building, and goodness knows what he was doing, but he stopped because he saw me there with my billy club and an SP on one arm and introduced himself and wanted to know, why did I join the Navy? What this and what that? Little personal questions. And I was dumbfounded. And I was also dumbfounded to find out how short he was.
I'm sure that's a wonderful memory
But
to have.
it is, and I can see his smile and his saluting like that and shaking hand, putting his hand out.
Yes.
And I thought, what wonderful people we have in our country. The things that he was noted for and the things that he did, and here he stopped and talked to a lonely Wave who had never seen him except in pictures.
That's wonderful.
And so I just had a love for the Navy from then on. There's go Navy, beat Army. That was my goal. I didn't hate anybody. We always laughed. When the Army-Navy games were played in Philadelphia, and we went to the games, Bob and I always had written in advance for the tickets. And when those games were being played, we were all in a great big open field for a parking lot. And I always brought a lot of food and hot cocoa and stuff like that. And when Navy had finally beaten Army that year, and I was so excited, and I saw all these cadets gathered around a car, and it was cold. It's Army-Navy game, it's not a warm day. And it was cold, and I went over to these kids, and I said, sorry you lost the game, but I have some hot cocoa that might cheer you up. And I brought over a thermos of cocoa and a bunch of cookies. And you can't have animosity toward the other guy. I can't understand why Alabama and Auburn don't like one another. It just doesn't make any sense to me. When Bob went to undergraduate, he went to Harvard. And so when he was going to the B school, one of his friends, who was younger than he, who didn't like sports, offered Bob his student tickets to all the games. He had to pay for them, but this fellow wasn't interested, and he lived down the street from where Bob did. So yes, we had 40-yard seats for Bob's first year at the B school, and 50-yard seats for the. You see, the seats for the students are 50-yard seats for the seniors, 40-yard seats for the juniors, 30-yard seats for the sophomores, and the freshmen just sit on the 10-yard line. And they play music, and after the game, the band stays and they play music, and people wander from their seats, and you just get together with both sides and you play the music from both schools.
You have some beautiful, you have a medallion and a lapel pin that regard your time in the service. Can you tell us about those? Your medallion and your lapel pin.
The medallion is something I purchased as a money saver, money maker, when the waves were trying to become women in military service for America. Yeah. And in order to get this, you just paid $75 and it's solid silver, and it's a silver dollar. And to me, I only wear it on special occasions, and I thought today was an occasion.
I would think so. How about your lapel pin?
And this one, I don't know, I just picked this out of a little box that I have where I have military stuff in. And
it's a Navy and American flags.
The Navy and American flag.
Yes, yes.
And it's like Marine and American flag.
Yes.
And you have to have pride in something of what you do. During one of the weekends, and we had only Sunday off. We all worked all week long. And if they needed you later, you work later. And that was all it was. But I met a Marine at a dance. And it was there were two big hotels in downtown Washington, not downtown, but near the White House. Woodman Park and another one, I can't remember the name.
Willard?
But on Saturday, Willard.
Willard.
Well, they had a big ballroom there, and on Saturday nights, the ballroom was taken over by the military. Something that the military could get together and dance and have a little fun. And you meet someone different whenever you go. And I met a Marine there one night, and he had just received he had just made lieutenant. And I'm not sure whether they came up from North Carolina or not. It doesn't make any difference, but he was there. Anyway, and once we started to dance, we continued to dance the rest of that evening, and we could walk home from where the hotel was to where I lived. You walk 2 miles, so what? You were out in the fresh air. You don't take a taxi if you're not going to pay that much money. Won't take us very long to get that kind of thing. That was our attitude. And so, anyway, he took me back to to where I was living, and he asked me what I was doing the next day. He said he was going to have to leave town by noon, but he wanted to see me for breakfast the next day. So we set a time, and I met him for breakfast. And during that time, he said something that I carried with me forever. He wanted to buy me a gift. And I said, you have only known me 48 hours. You shouldn't be spending your money on me. Let's go get something for your mother. And we went to a little jewelry store, and he bought something for his mother. And when he was saying goodbye that day, he said, "If I write to you, will you please write back to me?" He said, "You're the kind of a girl a guy should marry." And it's the kind of thing that all sorts of things go on, now especially, a free living. It feels good to do it. And I'm not saying that we were Simon Pure. I don't know what other people did, but I know what I did and what I waited for. I waited for the day I was married. And believe it or not, so did Bob. He said he waited because he was scared he might get into trouble.
Mary, this has been fascinating, and it's been an absolute honor and pleasure to hear all these stories and about your experiences in the Navy. And America was so fortunate to have women like yourself that dedicated themselves to the war effort. And we thank you so much for being here, and we wish you the best. And I think Fairhope is really fortunate to have you here.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I feel lucky that you asked me to come.
Okay.